my coach is recommending fasted cardio 6 to 7 days a week. Is this actually better for fat loss? It's a pretty big inconvenience because I have to drop off my kids on the way to work in the morning. It means I would have to get up another hour prior to getting everyone ready in order to complete this, in addition to having to go back to the gym after work and lift. Thoughts? So the thing is, like, when it comes to structured cardio, I do think that a lot of people, they live in a very like bro-y mentality where they're like, okay, well, if it's fasted, it's going to help you burn fat even better than if it's fed. And the reality is, like, I think if you have the ability to do it in separate sessions, I think there are benefits that I would actually deem as like better relative to training performance, as opposed to if, you know, you do your cardio post-workout or do it even pre-workout, which I hate. Like, that's the least favorable option. But if you're someone who's like, hey, my schedule allows for it, I can go for 2 separate sessions that have a pretty big gap in between, that would be ideal. And I actually think it's better that way because, I mean, you're actually segmenting up cardio, the thing that's going to drive a lot of systemic fatigue, away from training. So that is like largely, I would say, my recommendation. Realistically, I don't think a lot of people's schedules are necessarily going to allow for that. If it does, fantastic. But what I tend to find is that breaking up the cardio into segments, and I actually find with most clients, I just give them a weekly total. I do give constraints around like, hey, if you're doing it pre-workout, I don't want you to do more than like 5 to 10 minutes. If you're doing it post-workout, like immediately post-lift, I don't really want you doing more than like 20, 30, depending on the modality. In the case where you're trying to fit in, let's say, an hour of cardio immediately after your training session, it's like your training session's hour and a half, 2 hours, you're going to do an hour of cardio. You're not going to get home until literally almost like 3.5, 4 hours past that if you have a long commute, which is the case for a lot of people. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's ideal. I would question though, like the concerns I would have are whether or not you have the ability to actually sacrifice the sleep that you're going to end up sacrificing from getting up an hour earlier. If you are, like, if you're someone who's like, yo, like, like, you have kids, it's like if you barely get 7 hours a night, and this would then scooch this back into like 5.5 or 6. I don't love that. Like, I think that's going to be more detrimental. And I would actually recommend in that case to really ramp up step count predominantly. So if you're only at like 6,000 steps a day, that would be something. I mean, it's going to be a little bit of a hike in terms of like allocating the time to do this. But if that's something you can be like, okay, I'm going to be able to walk for 30 minutes at night, even if it's just around the block. Like, I mean, depending on how old your kids are, maybe you take them with you if it's not super late or cold, whatever. I'm just coming up with ideas. I'm just saying, like, okay, maybe you go to work and you have kids. So those are really the constraints that we have to adhere to. I would also say on the days that you are not weightlifting, these I would make cardio days. And this has been a really like significant, I would say, asset to my own fat loss phases, my own builds, is like making those non-training days purely cardio days. So I like put a big chunk of it there. It might be 60 minutes. Really don't go past 60 minutes. But I have 4 of those days. So if I had to do, let's say, 240 minutes, so 60 minutes 4 times a week, that includes me not doing any cardio, any of my 3 lower days, which I think is preferable. In terms of fat loss, I think ultimately we have to consider how the lack of sleep is really going to affect you. And I'm not a fan of like telling people like, hey, let's cut into your sleep if it's already, you know, on the brink of being too low. It would be nice. Like, it would be nice if you're someone who gets like 10 hours of sleep and you can cut back on it. But I mean, very rarely am I going to recommend reducing sleep, specifically when we're talking about doing cardio. So just my 2 cents. Take it for what you will. I mean, if they have specific regimens, I would even pose like this question to them, be like, how much more fat am I going to lose by doing cardio fasted as opposed to doing it this other way? And I would even like lay it out kind of like how I just did, be like, hey, what if I did this instead? Would this be adequate? Because this is going to make my life so much easier and it's going to be realistic for me to stick to without compromising my sleep.